Chapter 26 of the Hand of Fu-Manchu. The Hand of Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 26 The Demon's Self. Through the glass panes of the skylight I looked down upon a scene so bizarre that my actual environment became blotted out, and I was mentally translated to Cairo, to that quarter of Cairo immediately surrounding the famous square of the Fountain, to those indescribable streets, wherefrom arises the perfume of deathless evil, wherein, to the wailing, luresome music of the reed pipe, painted dancing girls sway in the wild abandon of dances that were ancient when Thebes was the city of 100 gates. I seemed to stand again in El Wasser. The room below was rectangular, and around 3 of the walls were divans strewn with garish cushions, whilst highly coloured Eastern rugs were spread upon the floor. 4 lamps swung on chains, 2 from either of the beams which traversed the apartment. They were fine examples of native perforated brasswork. Upon the divans some 8 or 9 men were seated, fully half of whom were Orientals or half castes. Before each stood a little inlaid table bearing a brass tray, and upon the trays were various boxes, some apparently containing sweetmeats, others cigarettes. 1 or 2 of the visitors smoked curious long-stemmed pipes and sipped coffee. Even as I leaned from the platform surveying that incredible scene (incredible in a street of Soho), another devotee of hashish entered, a tall, distinguished-looking man wearing a light coat over his evening dress.
"God!" whispered Smith beside me. "Sir Bingham Pyne of the India Office! You see, Petrie, you see? This place is a lure! My God!"
He broke off as I clutched wildly at his arm. The last arrival having taken his seat in a corner of the divan, 2 heavy curtains draped before an opening at one end of the room parted, and a girl came out, carrying a tray such as already reposed before each of the other men in the room. She wore a dress of dark coloured gauze, banded about with gold tissue and embroidered with gold thread and pearls, and around her shoulders floated, so ethereally that she seemed to move in a violet cloud, a scarf of Delhi muslin. A white yashmak trimmed with gold tissue concealed the lower part of her face. My heart throbbed wildly. I seemed to be choking. By the wonderful hair alone I must have known her, by the great brilliant eyes, by the shape of those slim white ankles, by every movement of that exquisite form. It was Karamaneh. I sprang madly back from the rail, and Smith had my arm in an iron grip. "Where are you going?" he snapped. "Where am I going?" I cried. "Do you think..." "What do you propose to do?" he interrupted harshly. "Do you know so little of the resources of Dr. Fu Manchu that you would throw yourself blindly into that den? Damn it all, man, I know what you suffer. But wait, wait! We must not act rashly. Our plans must be well considered." He drew me back to my former post and clapped his hand on my shoulder sympathetically. Clutching the rail like a man frenzied, as indeed I was, I looked down into that infamous den again, striving hard for composure. Karamaneh listlessly placed the tray upon the little table before Sir Bingham Pyne, and withdrew without vouchsafing him a single glance in acknowledgment of his unconcealed admiration. A moment later, above the dim clamour of London far below, there crept to my ears a sound which completed the magical quality of the scene, rendering that sky platform on a roof of Soho a magical carpet bearing me to the golden Orient. This sound was the wailing of a reed pipe. "The company is complete," murmured Smith. "I had expected this." Again the curtains parted, and a Ghizayeh glided out into the room. She wore a white dress, clinging closely to her figure from shoulders to hips, where it was clasped with an ornate girdle, and a skirt of sky blue gauze which clothed her as Io was clothed of old. Her arms were covered with gold bangles, and gold bands were clasped about her ankles. Her jet black, frizzy hair was unconfined and without ornament, and she wore a sort of highly coloured scarf so arranged that it effectually concealed the greater part of her face, but served to accentuate the brightness of the great flashing eyes. She had unmistakable beauty of a sort, but how different from the sweet witchery of Karamaneh! With a bold, swinging grace she walked down the centre of the room, swaying her arms from side to side and snapping her fingers. "Zarmi!" exclaimed Smith. But his exclamation was unnecessary, for already I had recognized the evil Eurasian who was so efficient a servant of the Chinese doctor. The wailing of the pipes continued, and now faintly I could detect the throbbing of a darabouka. This was El Wasser indeed. The dance commenced, its every phase followed eagerly by the motley clientele of the hashish house. Zarmi danced with an insolent nonchalance that nevertheless displayed her barbaric beauty to greatest advantage. She was lithe as a serpent, graceful as a young panther, another Lamia come to damn the souls of men with those arts denounced in a long dead age by Apollonius of Tyana. She seemed at once some penanced lady elf, some demon's mistress, or the demon's self. Entranced against my will, I watched the Eurasian until, the barbaric dance completed, she ran from the room, and the curtains concealed her from view. How my mind was torn between hope and fear that I should see Karamaneh again! How I longed for one more glimpse of her, yet loathed the thought of her presence in that infamous house. She was a captive, of that there could be no doubt, a captive in the hands of the giant criminal whose wiles were endless, whose resources were boundless, whose intense cunning had enabled him for years to weave his nefarious plots in the very heart of civilization and remain immune. Suddenly "That woman is a sorceress," muttered Nayland Smith. "There is about her something serpentine, at once repelling and fascinating. It would be of interest, Petrie, to learn what state secrets have been filched from the brains of habitués of this den, and interesting to know from what unsuspected spy-hole Fu-Manchu views his nightly catch. If..." His voice died away in a most curious fashion. I have since thought that here was a case of true telepathy, for as Smith spoke of Fu Manchu's spy-hole, the idea leapt instantly to my mind that this was it, this strange platform upon which we stood. I drew back from the rail, turned, stared at Smith. I read in his face that our suspicions were identical. Then "Look, look!" whispered Weymouth. He was gazing at the trap door, which was slowly rising, inch by inch, inch by inch. Fascinatedly, raptly, we all gazed. A head appeared in the opening, and some vague, reflected light revealed two long, narrow, slightly oblique eyes watching us. They were brilliantly green.
"By God!" came in a mighty roar from Weymouth. "It's Dr. Fu Manchu!"
As one man we leapt for the trap. It dropped with a resounding bang, and I distinctly heard a bolt shot home. A guttural voice, the unmistakable, unforgettable voice of Fu Manchu, sounded dimly from below. I turned and sprang back to the rail of the platform, peering down into the hashish house. The occupants of the divans were making for the curtained doorway. Some, who seemed to be in a state of stupor, were being assisted by the others and by the man Ismail, who had now appeared upon the scene. Of Karamaneh, Zarmi, or Fu Manchu there was no sign. Suddenly the lights were extinguished. "This is maddening!" cried Nayland Smith. "Maddening! No doubt they have some other exit, some hiding place, and they are slipping through our hands." Inspector Weymouth blew a shrill blast upon his whistle, and Smith, running to the rail of the platform, began to shatter the panes of the skylight with his foot.
"That's hopeless, sir!" cried Weymouth. "You'd be torn to pieces on the jagged glass."
Smith desisted with a savage exclamation, and stood beating his right fist into the palm of his left hand and glaring madly at the Scotland Yard man.
"I know I'm to blame," admitted Weymouth, "but the words were out before I knew I'd spoken.
Ah!" as an answering whistle came from somewhere in the street below. "But will they ever find us?" He blew again, shrilly. Several whistles replied, and a wisp of smoke floated up from the shattered pane of the skylight. "I can smell petrol," muttered Weymouth. An ever increasing roar, not unlike that of an approaching storm at sea, came from the streets beneath. Whistles skirled remotely and intimately, and sometimes one voice, sometimes another, would detach itself from this stormy background with weird effect. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the hashish house there went on ceaselessly a splintering and crashing, as though a determined assault were being made upon a door. A light shone up through the skylight. Back once more to the rail I sprang, looked down into the room below, and saw a sight never to be forgotten. Passing from divan to curtained door, from piles of cushions to stacked up tables, and bearing a flaming torch hastily improvised out of a roll of newspaper, was Dr. Fu Manchu. Everything inflammable in the place had been soaked with petrol, and his gaunt yellow face lighted by the ever growing conflagration, so that it truly seemed not the face of a man, but that of a demon of the hells. The Chinese doctor ignited point after point. Smith!" I screamed, "we are trapped! That fiend means to burn us alive!"